Content warning for sexism, bigamy, philandering, and double entendres. Action, excitement,
horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns,
a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
And in return for your praise of me, I will tell you that, if your wife has been carried off by a devil, your affair is one which Koschei alone can remedy. Assuredly, I think it is to him you must go for justice. But how may I come to him, grandmother? Oh, as to that, it does not matter at all what road you follow. All highways, as the saying is, lead roundabout to Koschei. The one thing needful is not to stand still. This much I will tell you also for your song's sake, because that was an excellent song, and nobody ever made a song in praise of me before today. Now Jurgen wondered to see what a simple old creature was this Mother Sarita, who sat before him, shaking and grinning and frail as a dead leaf, with her head wrapped in a common kitchen towel, and whose power was so enormous. To think of it, Jurgen reflected, that the world I inhabit is ordered by beings who are not 1/10 so clever as I am. I have often suspected as much, and it is decidedly unfair. Now let me see if I cannot make something out of being such a monstrous clever fellow. For a brief period in the 1920s, the defining figure of the fantasy genre in America wasn't Robert E. Howard or H.P. Lovecraft, it was James Branch Cabell. Lynn Carter once called Cabell the only American author of genius to devote his career to fantasy, and his books were wildly popular. Yet Cabell is almost forgotten today. If he's remembered at all, it's for his then wildly controversial novel Jurgen, which we'll be looking at today. Hello, I'm Adam Prosser, and with me is Philip Rice.
Hello.
Hello, and welcome again to What Mad Universe, the show where we look at pulp and the origins of pop culture stuff in sci-fi and genre fiction. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at what is nowadays a pretty obscure novel called Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice by James Branch Cabell.
From 1919.
1919. It's very... the hubbub was in the 20s.
Yeah.
So it's it was sort of right at the tail end of 1919. So I'd say it's a very 1920s novel.
Very much so. And it didn't get popular till the 20s, like you said.
Right. Well, and it was popular because it went on trial.
Yeah. Yeah. They tried to ban it for its various sexual double entendres and
right. And apparently the joke about papal infallibility, Cabell said he wasn't 100% clear what they were angry about, but he thought that was the thing that really set them off, was the joke about papal infallibility.
There are a lot of sex jokes, though.
There are, yes. It's a very, as it were, decadent kind of novel.
I'm very intimidated by your big sword.
Yeah. Yes, he does not savonate from using all the possible inclinations of having a sword. Literally Excalibur, actually, that he has.
Yeah, but also at one point when he's pretending to be a king and the lights go out and the woman says, I didn't believe you were king because you didn't carry a large scepter, but now I see you have a very large scepter indeed.
Yep.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. He's in some ways he's almost the he's got the Oscar Wildean kind of touch to it. He's almost the P.G. Wodehouse of fantasy, except American and maybe raunchier and with a bit more teeth to it.
Yeah.
Or F. Scott Fitzgerald-ish, maybe in some ways. He's clearly of that literary scene, as it were. And the reason I find this book interesting is just that, and I think we've mentioned this before, people have a tendency to think J.R. Tolkien almost invented modern fantasy, when in fact the genre was around and thriving for decades before him, but it just had a very different style to it. And
various styles. Yeah,
yeah.
It went through a number of permutations before Tolkien sort of arrived, and then everybody was just sort of either imitating Tolkien or
Right.
trying to deviate from Tolkien. But
Yeah.
it was all, like we said in the last episode with the book on Roman history. It's either copying or a reaction to.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Tolkien became the massive center of gravity that everyone had to respond to when they were talking about. I mean, to a certain extent, Robert E. Howard as well, and
Yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft. But
But people don't. They're not as household names, I suppose, in
Right.
their own right.
I would say most people know Conan the Barbarian. If
Yeah,
they don't
yeah.
necessarily
I
know
mean-
his name, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, as people know who Tolkien is.
Right.
There are, I guess there are movies about Howard as well, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, well, it's you can almost say that at that point when J.R. Tolkien, when Lord of the Rings was published in the 50s, because of course Tolkien did The Hobbit, which is not quite in the same mode as Lord of the Rings to the same extent. The point being that there was this very elaborate pre-created history and this world, this very elaborate world building that he'd locked down. That was the new thing that he pioneered, I would say.
That had been done to some degree, but not as elaborately. Like Tolkien really brought it out.
Right.
Like other people had invented places and
people would always, they'd always say, yes, I came into this imaginary kingdom. But the idea of literally, I've worked out this entire history, this entire language of this other sub-created world. Sub-creation was the word he used for it. That was the big new thing. And then that kind of became the thing that fantasy was the go-to for. There were exceptions. Like I say, that's the reason I bring up Robert E. Howard is that there were exceptions, which was you could talk about purely pulp swashbuckling fantasy would probably people did do Conan knockoffs into the 60s and 70s, and they probably wouldn't have as dense a backstory to their worlds in the same way. So if you're going to do something that was non-Tolkien fantasy, it's leaning a little more towards the pulpy Robert E. Howard branch of things, I would say.
Yeah.
But they did tend to overlap each other to a degree where, like, even when you're doing a pulpy sword slinging thing, you might have a bit more of an elaborate backstory to the world because of J.R. Tolkien.
and
again.
specifically elves and dwarves and some of the other trappings.
Yeah, that all the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and that it really got codified. I guess the late 70s and 80s. That was when it really started to roll in again because of Dungeons and Dragons, and because the Tolkien paperbacks broke through in the U.S. I think more in the 60s than they did earlier. So there were some, and there's C.S. Lewis as well. But so then you go to the kids' fantasy stuff. Fantasy wasn't huge in certainly not in North America in the 50s and early 60s. It's sort of
Particularly not fantasy for adults,
right?
Specifically,
exactly.
which this definitely is.
Yeah, if you're going to see fantasy in the 50s, post World War II, up until the mid 60s, it would have been maybe a riff on King Arthur.
This is as well.
Yeah, this is what I'm going to say. It's you didn't quite get into really wild pure fantasy until, even when you did, it would always be there'd almost be a there's a scientific explanation for it kind of story in comics and things of the time. There's rarely there's a wizard who can cast spells. It's almost framed in a different way. But before so this is just an interesting look at the time before Tolkien took over.
This is a book I had heard of, but I just hadn't gotten to yet. So I'm glad I finally did, because it's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it.
Yeah, it's a romp through folklore and mythology and literature for sure.
Yeah.
He draws on characters from many different. I mean, arguably someone like C.S. Lewis did the same. He brought in Greco-Roman and medieval European
and Father
stuff.
Christmas.
Yeah, Father Christmas. But he had centaurs and fauns alongside, unicorns and whatever other fantasy. It was much more of a medieval type fantasy world, Narnia. In this case, Cabell brings in everything. He does Russian, he does Norse. Arthurian is definitely a go-to. He references ancient Greek stuff.
Yeah, a lot of ancient Greek stuff. Nessus is a character, the centaur.
Right. Nessus the centaur is the character who traditionally kills Hercules. You think of Hercules as becoming immortal, as he did in later versions, but in the original story, he's killed by a centaur who gives him a shirt which is poisoned with his own blood.
Yeah, he becomes immortal afterwards.
Right. Oh, okay.
After his death. Yeah,
there's different versions of it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's just significant because Nessus gives Jurgen a shirt as well in the story, which is clearly a nod to that. Even though Well, then the question becomes, well, the shirt doesn't poison him, but it's like, but does it? Is
Metaphorical poison.
Exactly. It's the glittering. There's a lot of symbolism in this book.
Yeah.
He's definitely, things represent things, and when a centaur gives him the shirt, and it sort of represents his, even before he literally becomes younger and gets to relive his youth, it sort of represents almost his illusions, I guess, if you want, if it's his preconceptions about the world, which, because of course they get faded away over the course of the story.
We should probably start at the beginning.
Yes, let's tell the plot.
Okay. So Jurgen, and we're going with the pronunciation of Jurgen. We're not clear on that, but that's what we're going to stick to.
As a Scandinavian name, it's Jurgen. This is an American guy writing about a character who supposedly lives in medieval France.
No, not even medieval, Arthurian era France. So,
right.
Like, who knows?
Yeah, a fantastical era as well as place.
Though later on, it's suggested that it comes from jargon, so I don't know.
Right, that's right.
Etymologically connected to jargon, so I don't know. We'll say Jurgen.
Yeah. Well, you had an audiobook that said Jurgen.
Yeah.
So we're going to go with Jurgen. Yeah.
So he comes from a place in southern France. Was it southern France?
Yeah, southern France.
Called
Poitem.
Poitem. Thank you.
Which is probably a mashup of Poitiers and Angoulême, which are both real places in France.
Yeah. And this is a fictional place Cabell went to for pretty much every story he wrote throughout his career.
I'm not sure of everyone, but he definitely went
There's
through
a long
20-year period where he was writing like a 25-volume saga, which we can talk about later. But
that goes from Arthurian times to modern day Virginia. So
right.
So Jurgen is an older man. He works as a pawnbroker. And he's walking one day, and a priest curses evil, and he says, evil's fine.
Yeah. Why you gotta be so mean to evil?
Yeah.
That's what he says.
Because Jurgen is a very, he's a trickster character sort of thing. Like, I see him as sort of like a Brer Rabbit or a coyote from various native cultures. Well,
he calls himself a monstrous clever fellow, which gives you, he's a very, I'm such a rogue. Oh, I'm so naughty. He's that kind of guy.
But he is very good at rhetoric, and he's very good at convincing people of his of how to go about things in ways that they think suits them, but actually suits him. So that's the kind of character we're dealing with throughout the story. Anyway,
he's both a poet and a pawnbroker. He was a poet in his youth, and then he got a job as a pawnbroker, basically.
Because he got married,
right?
To a woman named Dame Lisa, and
he praises evil to the priest, basically, and then immediately afterwards, a strange gentleman, all black, not as in African American, as in has solidly black skin, shows up and says, "Well, wasn't that nice of you to say a nice word for evil? Nobody ever has a nice thing to say for evil." And I can't remember exactly how he gets on the subject of his wife.
Yeah, but basically, Jurgen would have been a poet if he hadn't gotten married. So Cochet is the character we're dealing with, the black man. Decides to reward Jurgen by snatching away his wife and allowing him to, well, as we see, sort of sets up the whole story.
Right.
Jurgen's
kind of like, if only I didn't have this wife nagging me all the time, I could get stuff done.
Yeah, it's pretty sexist throughout the book, but yeah.
But then at the same point, to be fair, that's the character more than it is necessarily the theme, because he immediately realizes, wait, I messed up.
Yeah.
and part of it is guilt.
No, I mean the wife being a nagging, and she is portrayed that way. So
this is partly what the story is about.
Yeah,
too. It's in a way, it's about learning to have appreciation for the women in your life.
Yes.
That is kind of the theme of the story.
So Cochet, and he's repeatedly referred to throughout the story as the maker of things as they are. So he made the world as it is.
Right.
And Cochet is actually a character from Russian folklore.
That's right, yes.
Readers might remember him as a villain from Hellboy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't read a lot of Hellboy.
I think there's actually a miniseries recently based around that character. So,
right.
but Hellboy fought him at one point.
Yeah. In Russian folklore, Koshchei is usually the sorcerer or giant or whatever, known as Koshchei the Deathless. And the classic story about him is, I can never be killed because I've hidden my heart or my soul or my life, depending on the version, inside an egg, inside a duck, inside a well, inside a church, on an island, in a lake, surrounded by fire and guarded by dragons. So the only way you could kill me is to find that. So the hero, named Ivan, inevitably in Russian folklore, has to go and find that that heart, and that's the only way to kill Koshchei.
Mm-hmm.
So
Horcruxes, basically.
Yeah, essentially, yes, it's the basis for the idea of the Horcrux. Yeah. Anyway, Koshchei takes his wife away, and Jurgen goes from.
But this is actually a very different take on Koshchei. It's basically just a name only thing. But Koshchei here he's initially portrayed as the devil.
Right.
But it turns out he's not, really. He's more like, maybe in some senses, he's more like the Gnostic devil, the creator of the physical world. Yeah. But it turns out here he also created the spiritual God. Yeah. So it's sort of Gnosticism, but also the opposite of Gnosticism.
Yeah, Cabell literally called him in one of his notes. He said, he's basically the demiurge. And he said, I wrote it as the devil took his wife away, but by the time I got to the end of the story, I was like, I think the quote is, to elevate the novel, I had to make him the Gnostic demiurge who had created the entire universe. Basically.
Yeah, I guess we should briefly explain what Gnosticism. I don't know.
No, I think people can look it up. We don't have time to talk about it. But it's just the idea of...
Listen to Apocrypals. That's a good podcast.
Whether there's a real God or whether the God, is just sort of fooling us and the God is bad and there's a better God behind that God is the idea.
But in this case, the even the better God was created by Koshchei.
Right. Yeah. Anyway. It's the idea of a false God versus a true God, essentially. Yeah. So Jurgen basically goes, well, I've got to do the manly thing, as he keeps calling it, and get my wife back. That's the noble thing to do.
Yeah.
So that his quest is to go and rescue his wife from Koshchei.
Initially.
But he gets very distracted along the way. But of course, it's a journey of self-discovery is the point. And he first meets the centaur, as we said, Nessus. He meets Nessus first. I'm trying to remember the order in which everything happens.
Yeah, a lot of stuff happens in this book.
He gets taken away to the garden between dawn and sunrise.
Yeah, which can only be reached by an imaginary creature. That's the explanation. So that's why Nessus has to take him there.
Right. And there he meets the woman who he loved, the woman who was the great love of his life, Dorothy La Désirée.
Yeah, when he was a teenager.
And in fact, he's explicitly, it's like, it's not even her, it's your teenage idea of who she was. Yeah, exactly. Basically. So
there's a lot of that in this story about the idea of what's the word? Nostalgia. Yeah, nostalgia, looking back at things better than they actually were.
Your illusions in the classical romantic sense of, the things you cling to even though they aren't really true, basically. And there's a lot of... that's, again, what the book is about. It's about breaking through that. And he starts as an older man, and he knows that he's already gone through this, but he's still kind of clinging to it, and that's why he has to go through this whole process again and kind of reiterate what he's been through.
So he ends up meeting...
Sarita.
Madame Sarita, who's...
Well, she's called one of the Leishi, who appear to be gods.
Yeah.
And she's the goddess of Wednesday.
Yeah.
She's the... there's one for every day of the week. She's the goddess of Wednesday, the most mundane, boring day of the week, essentially. Yeah. The one who makes you go, oh my God, when's the weekend ever going to get here?
Her job is to make everything... what was it again?
She bleaches things.
Yeah, she bleaches things, so they fade.
Yeah, and as we say, Jurgen's been given this shimmering coat, and she talks about, well, I'll fade that in time as well. So she's essentially the process of time wearing you down, in personified. But Jurgen gives her this very flattering speech, which I mentioned at the beginning, and as a result, she basically gives him a gift, which is to go back to his youth and
to a specific Wednesday.
Right, to a specific Wednesday, and he can sort of do things over from how they actually played out.
Yeah. So the love of his young life, he tries to win her from the guy who actually ended up marrying her.
Right.
But he's
Heitman Michael.
Heitman Michael.
Right?
Yeah. But he fails because Heitman Michael is just a better swordsman than he is.
Right.
And he ends up stabbing him in the back.
Right. Yeah, Jurgen stabs
Yeah.
Michael. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So-
Established very early on that Jurgen is a pretty immoral guy.
yeah, he's
essentially.
he's a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very selfish.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Jurgen ends up sort of failing in this section, failing to rewrite his life because even though he's killed this guy, she's like, you just killed a man.
Exactly. Well, of course, that was the woman. That was the guy she loved and ended up marrying, even though she wasn't admitting it at this point in history, basically.
Yeah.
But then he runs off. But the thing is, he stays young for quite a bit more time.
Yeah.
And he kind of goes, "Oh, Sarita forgot about me, I guess. So I get to stay young." And so then he runs off and has a series of romantic adventures, all of which involve bedding various women.
Yeah, starting with Guinevere. He rescues Guinevere from Arthurian legends and ends up trying to woo her away from Arthur, but
Well, I don't think he's actually wooing her away from Arthur. I think this is a set. He's at a time from before.
Yeah, that's
Arthur
what I mean.
meets
Like,
her. Yeah.
Arthur is wooing her at this time. Or one has requested that he marry her.
Right.
I don't think they've met yet.
I can't remember. Does Jurgen know the Arthurian legend,
No.
or is he?
No,
just,
he hasn't.
Yeah.
Because I was confused by that initially. I thought he had traveled back in time further,
Right.
but no, this is just set. Yeah.
Around the time of King
Yeah.
Arthur,
He
which
does-
of course never happened. So
Yeah.
again, this is all in a fairy tale kind of
Yeah,
world to begin with.
but so Jurgen is not aware throughout the story of who King Arthur is.
Right. Well, arguably, yeah. See, it's significant because then later he meets like Achilles and characters from ancient Greek myth as well.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a theme that it's just kind of all happening in a timeless legendarium.
Yeah, but that's like a that's a specific island where all those heroes live. So.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay.
We'll get into that.
Yeah. It's not meant to be even, superficially logical in terms of the historical time frame here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can roughly slot it into places with the understanding that later areas are set in sort of imaginary worlds that
Right.
he's sent to.
Right. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, so there's a whole bit with Guinevere. He's trying to woo her, and he does sleep with her. At least it's it never outright says he has sex with women, but the lights go out, and we can't see
Yeah.
beyond that.
Well, and of course this is significant because it's like, well, she's betrothed to Arthur, and
Yeah.
she's a virginal princess, as it were,
There's also a bit repeatedly about his shadow, which is strange. And it's sort of following him around, and yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah, he keeps noticing his shadow.
It's hard to
acting
summarize
weird.
the plot of this book because there
It's a
isn't
series
really.
of-
Yeah.
It's a series of encounters. Well, in fact, Cabell wrote it. It was a short story originally called, there it is, Some Ladies and Jurgen. Was the original title of a short, and it was, I believe, published under that title. And he literally wanted to do a series of interlinked short stories, which were going to be each of the different, encounters that he had with women and so forth. The original story was basically just he meets Koschei, or the devil. Koschei, in the original story, it is the devil, not just Koschei, and he meets him and goes, and his wife gets taken away, so he goes to get her back. Koschei does the bit that he does at the climax of the story, which we'll get to, and that's the end of the story. But he basically says, but the significant thing is that the climax is him looking over a bunch of different women, and Cabell basically decided, well, it would be interesting if he'd already had relationships with all these women who existed. So that's what the story becomes. It's about him having all these relationships. Again, it was going to be a series of stories. He basically ended up turning it into a novel instead, and then writing all these other stories that tie in, which we can talk about in a bit. It is part of we say it wasn't as elaborate as Tolkien, but it ended up being, 25 different stories, poems, books, all these other things that tie into the land of Poitam.
I think there's also like historical biographies and things.
Right. Well, it's all tied to this one character that I believe either the next book or 2 books later he wrote a book called Figures of Earth, which is the first chronologically story, and it's about a guy called Dom Manuel who becomes the ruler of Poitam. In fact, I think he literally founds the kingdom of Poitam. And Jurgen's love, Dorothy, is his second daughter.
Okay.
So there is a whole genealogy that descends in his mind from Manuel, all the way up to modern-day Litchfield, Virginia, his family. So
Which
I
is
was
a fictional place as well.
Right, that's
Litchfield, not Virginia.
Yeah, the strange land of Virginia. But they go. They decide what was I going to say? Sorry. I was surprised that Jurgen is not actually Manuel's descendant. But that makes sense because Manuel becomes a royalty, so Jurgen would be unrelated to that. But it does tie in. All these events kind of tie into this one larger reality.
So one of the characters in this area is the Lady of the Lake, who in this is Ananias.
Yes.
Who is a sort of a pre-Christian goddess.
Anaides.
Anaides.
Yeah.
She's
a sorceress.
Yeah, she's a sorceress. She's actually a mythological character, but in this case, it's sort of a bunch of characters combined into one.
Right. Apparently, in an early draft, it was going to be Cleopatra.
Okay.
And he replaced it with, I guess to have the transition from Arthurian to this, he made it the Lady of the Lake. So,
she is the ruler of a place called Cocaine, which is a thing in medieval folklore, sort of land of luxury and idle pleasures.
Right. Yeah, that's almost too perfect, isn't it? It's called cocaine. With a Jane, but cocaine. Yeah, it is pronounced cocaine. But I'm just to emphasize, there's a G. And I mean, Cabell knew what he was doing. And it is actually interesting because cocaine was a pretty common drug in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It wasn't illegal until a bit later. I think it was just hitting the point when he wrote this where people started to say, oh, we should take it away. It's a vice.
Even in the Sherlock Holmes stories, Watson was always saying to stop doing that.
Right. But it was done more as you're smoking too much and you're doing too much cocaine, as opposed to, it wasn't illegal. It was medicine. It was a legitimate medicine. I think this book was written right at the point where cocaine would be seen as a little bit scandalous, even though it wasn't technically illegal at that point.
Yeah. He ends up marrying Anaides. He marries a lot of women in this story.
Yes.
And never divorces them, so...
No. He's a bigamist.
Yes, and that's dealt with. Or that's discussed. But, she has lots of... family and other, various gods and things coming. There's one point where Priapus is there, and who's a Greek fertility god, always depicted with a giant penis,
right?
Giant erect penis, and Jurgen says, this guy's giving me a complex, basically. But it turns out that him spending so much time there, he's sort of might start to integrate into the mythology, so he might become a mythological character in his own right.
Right.
And it's discussed, his name is related to Jurgen, so he'll probably be like I said, trickster god. Or
if I recall, it was the master philologist decides that he's a mythological element of folklore. His name meaning Jurgen is tied to the chatter of birds, so he's a sun god figure, whereas Anaides is a moon god figure. So naturally, they have to go apart. And Anaides says, that's the folklore. The sun god has to leave the moon god. So then he goes to go pick a fight with the master philologist, if I recall correctly, right?
Yeah. We didn't mention Caliburn, but a while back he had picked up the sword Caliburn, which is Excalibur.
Right.
Early name for Excalibur.
Right.
And he leaves it with Anaides, and that leads to Arthur getting
significantly,
it. Yeah.
And hey, there's nothing symbolic there that he leaves his sword with this lady. Just a sword. But I do. Well, that is significant as well. But I do like that. Then he goes. He's going to pick a fight with the master philologist who made it, so he had to separate. So he goes, and that's the one big real failure of the book is that he goes to pick a fight with the master philologist, and then he leaves 10 minutes later. The philologist completely convinced him, because of course he's a master philologist. He can talk anyone into anything, right?
And he gave him a cantrip or a cantrap,
right? Yes.
Which is just some nonsense about a pope,
right?
But it ends up coming in handy much later, though he tries to use it several times. And
he says, here's a magical piece of phrasing you can use. It's a spell, i.e. a sentence, which is that there was an error in the line of papal succession, so there was never Pope Stephen, what was the name of the
I
Pope?
can't remember.
The 25th
Yeah.
or something. They went right from the 24th to the 26th, and every time Jurgen gets into trouble, he tries to bring this out and mention it, and
they
everyone
just
kind of
say-
goes, "What?"
Yeah.
Yeah, but then it ends up saving him at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah.
Or not
So
saving him, but it helps him.
It does come in handy at one point.
Yes.
I guess it was bound to happen eventually.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway.
So he ends up being sent to Luki, which is actually a real island,
okay.
but here it's sort of presented as a sort of I don't know, Elysium field, or like a Greek sort of Greco paradise.
Right.
He ends up marrying a nymph, or a dryad.
Hamadryad.
Hamadryad.
Yes. Chloris the Hamadryad.
Yeah, who is also a actual myth. And the city on the island is Pseudopolis, which is ruled over by Queen Helen of Troy, or Queen Helen, but she was Helen of Troy, and she's married to Achilles. Helen looks exactly like Dorothy to...
Oh, it does right.
Yeah.
Well, she's supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world.
Exactly.
So she becomes basically whoever you'd think.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
and
a certain implication that these events happen and they're specifically tailored to him, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, go
Oh,
on.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Making it almost seem like it's not really happening in some ways.
There's a discussion later where some other people have seen, some other people Jurgen knew in his youth who have also somehow become young again
right.
through their own adventures. But they have an argument over which of the Desiree sisters she resembles.
Right, right.
Because they all were in love with a different one. So.
Right, exactly, yeah, yeah. Well, now, how is it on the island of Lecce, though? It's Lecce. It's the land of heroes or the land of myths or something.
Yeah.
How is that again?
It's not explained outright, but yeah, it's pretty much Greek mythology. So heroes and pastoral gods, and
Right.
like Silenus, the satyr, is there, and that sort of thing.
Right.
I think he's a satyr. Anyway.
And he gets married to Chloris as well.
Yeah.
And they live in a tree.
Yeah. But that area gets invaded by Philistus, the Philistines, which
Right.
are not sort of, but not really the Philistines of the Bible, but because they mention Goliath, but
Right.
yeah, they basically represent realists. The idea that
Right.
and they think this area is just in bad taste and should be wiped out.
Because it's too mythological.
Yeah,
Yes.
and they worship a god whose color is gray.
Right.
And they want to make everything gray.
Yes.
And they have a fire that burns gray. And
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then, so just a quick side note that this book was the subject of an indecency trial, as I think we mentioned. And it was brought there by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which is the greatest name ever. So yeah, it was brought up on charges. The judge basically threw it out and said this is ridiculous.
though after a while, it took a while.
Yeah, it took a year or two, and as Cabell basically sarcastically thanked the society for generating interest in his work.
And he wasn't kidding. Like he was unknown before then, and he became very popular because people were like, "This banned book is,
Yeah, it was 100% the thing that people say. It's it's the satanic verses kind of situation,
Yeah.
where everyone had to read it because of all the scandal and commotion about it. But then he actually later added a bit it's in the preface of this version that
Yeah.
I have, where Jurgen is literally put on trial by the Philistines.
Yeah.
Who's chief
yeah, it's a
prosecutor.
lost chapter that doesn't really fit in anywhere in the book
Right.
because he never goes to Philistus in the book.
Right.
Or in the main story, but this is sort of I don't know when it's supposed to happen in the
Oh,
timeline.
well, it's not. It's him just riffing ironically on what happened to
it's,
him in real life,
and
basically.
they're ruled over by a magistrate who's a dung beetle
Right, exactly.
who is accusing his poetry of being indecent, but he won't say what part was indecent.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that seems to have been an issue.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
I say, we can't figure out which part they were really objecting to, but it's not hard to guess, as you
Yeah.
say.
And I didn't know that whole bit at the beginning, and because I just thought that was like in media res thing, and it would go back to that at some point, but it never does.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
not literally a lost chapter.
Yeah.
He just wrote it after the fact to
and
make
then I read about the history of the
gag.
book, and it made sense. But
Well, then he wrote a literal whole other book about it called Taboo, which I haven't read. But,
Okay.
So he was obviously pretty fixated on
well, who wouldn't be?
Yeah, it was his notorious. But like I say, it helped his career, so he
Though
wasn't
he
too
apparently
bitter
didn't
about
like fame.
it. Okay. Well, he probably liked the money. that he
Yeah,
got.
he definitely probably liked the money, but apparently he didn't really like being that well known, and he just continued writing stories set in this place, and he quickly fell off the map, and he was probably happier for it.
Yeah. It was. A number of people said, well, if you'd written something else, you could have parlayed that into a real literary career, and he didn't want to. He just wanted to keep writing books about Poitin. Anyway, carry on. So,
Where was I?
Chloris and the Achilles and the Philistines invading.
Oh, geez, what happens next?
Well, they all, if I recall correctly, all the heroes and gods are so weightless they literally fly off into the air or something at one point.
No, but what's the next section?
Then they go.
Yeah. They sentence him to go to. They're sort of sending all these mythological creatures to the hell where they came.
Right.
So like they're going to. Most of them would be going to Hades, and
right.
But he ends up being sentenced to go to the hell of his fathers.
Right.
Which is specifically the hell dreamt up by his literal father.
Right. Yes.
And it's all his father's imagination creating this place. And the demons there do not like being torturing humans, but humans come there and say they deserve to be tortured.
Right.
And nothing's ever good enough for these humans.
Yeah.
They just feel so guilty about everything they've done that they
Yeah, exactly.
and we're trying our best here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, his Jurgen's father gets to create hell, and his grandmother gets to create heaven, as we find out.
Yeah.
Later. But yeah, it's specifically built around his father. Again, more evidence that it's all specifically tied to Jurgen's.
But there's also the implication that there's lots of other hells, and well, it outright says that. But yeah. But this is specifically his father's hell, so he ends up tricking his father into creating a wife for him.
Right.
A beautiful vampire woman.
Well, he doesn't create her, does he? He just lures her down to hell
No,
or something?
it's implied that he creates her.
Oh, okay.
Because he says he sort of tricks his father through rhetoric to say, like his father's putting him down, and Jurgen ends up saying, well, there aren't any women here. Oh, I'll bet you'll marry a woman, and she'll be some beautiful vampire, and you know. So, and it's implied that he actually imagined her, and that she came she had a history, but it was a retroactive history.
Okay.
And that she was actually dreamt up by his father. So.
Right.
And that's one of the things that sort of causes them to drift away, that he can't stop thinking about he says, you were sort of created by my dad, and
Yeah.
that's sort of weird.
Yeah. And it's Florimel the vampire.
And if I had known there was a major vampire character in this book, I would have read it a lot sooner. It's not advertised.
Well, she's about the most agreeable vampire you can possibly imagine.
She was buried. She was a seamstress in life, and a cat jumped over her grave, which of course would make her a vampire.
Right.
And that's an actual folkloric thing, There's various ways to become vampires in different traditions, and that's actually literally one of them.
Okay, cool.
But her sister refused to kill the cat because she liked cats, and so Florimel blames her sister for all the stuff she has to do.
Oh.
And Florimel, she goes off nightly to kill random men, and Jurgen doesn't really like hearing about that, but and they get married, and she's vacationing in hell, and they get married there. Bigamy is allowed in hell. Though hell is portrayed as a democracy.
Right.
It's a democratic system, but because they're at war with heaven, they gave emergency powers to their leader, which is Satan.
Right.
And it's been going on for thousands of years. So basically it's a dictatorship, but they talk high-minded about democracy.
Right.
This is interesting coming out of World War I.
Yeah, exactly.
Or after World War I, but yeah.
Yeah.
And also, leading into World War II, because Hitler was put in place with the
Yep.
special powers, and then took advantage.
Yeah, it's a cynical view of democracy, basically.
But it's very funny. I mean,
yeah.
the hell section is the funniest part of the book, I think.
Right. And now, how does he get out of hell again? What happens? Why does he get it? As you say, he gets kind of. He says, "You're my dad's creation, so I got to leave."
Yeah, I can't remember what the exact argument was, but he talked his way out of it. That's what he always does.
Well, I remember, and then he goes that's the thing. At that point, he's kind of determined to go to heaven. I believe.
He climbs up Jacob's ladder,
right?
Literally, and goes to heaven, which we find out was literally created for his grandmother,
right?
Because she showed up to Koschei and demanded to know where heaven was.
Right. Yeah.
And so he just created it and retroactively introduced it into the universe.
Right. And of course, Jurgen would never get into heaven, except this is where the cantrip comes in. He's able to say, oh, no, I'm Pope Stephen the 25th. He's like, no, we got all the popes. He's like, check again.
Oh, I think that's how he got in because...
that's what I'm saying.
Because they don't allow popes into hell because it makes them look bad.
Okay.
So he uses that cantrip to... I think, to talk them into letting him go up to heaven.
I thought that was how he got... Anyway, I thought that's how he got into heaven. But again, the point is that they go, no, we checked. All the popes are here. And he's like, no, check again. And he's like, no, you're right. We're missing the 25th, whatever. So he's able to claim to be that pope, basically. And get in. Yeah. And then he basically... He gives a big speech to God, who just kind of sits there and take it.
Yeah,
from what I remember,
because the God was created specifically by his grandmother.
Right.
It's his grandmother's imagining of God, so it's like the old-fashioned...
Yeah, and it's very openly, not even Jurgen at this point, but Cabell giving a speech about why I'm not religious anymore, basically. It's just flat out him saying, God of my grandfather, I don't believe in you anymore. Sorry, I've seen too much. Anyway,
yeah.
So it's pretty nakedly him just being able to write a speech.
It's not as bad as I've seen in some, like
it's not atheist bro.
Yeah. Like there was a bit in I didn't read the whole thing, but there's a bit in Ready Player One where he starts talking about how lame God is, and it's not that.
He's
a much better writer.
Cabell is way too witty to be, oh man, like he's not a sarcastic 13-year-old.
Yeah.
And this is very much, there's actually I found an intro to one, his first novel is called In the Eagle's Shadow, and he wrote an intro to it where he meets a neophyte writer who comes to his door and starts like mooning over everything, and it's revealed that that's himself in the past coming to meet himself in the future and saying, oh wow, look at all the great stuff you have. I want to write nice stories about nice people doing nice things. And Cabell's like, well, you'll try, but you're not going to be able to do that. You're just going to see too much. You're not going to be able. And the young Cabell says, my goal is to write the very nicest sorts of books. They would be about beautiful, fine girls and really splendid young men, and everything would come out all right in the end so they could get married and not be the sort of bitter and smart alecky and depressed people the way, he coughed, the way some people do. And this is him responding to the books that he'd read. So that's his description of his own books, essentially. There's very much cynicism, and actually Jurgen ends up with, I would say, in some ways, a positive ending, and like a more, it does try to find some a bit more warmth and humanity. Figures of Earth, which I've also read, is it echoes a lot of Jurgen, but it comes out a bit bleaker ultimately.
How does it get out of heaven? Sorry, it's hard to remember some of the transitions between the various parts.
Well, if I recall, he just pushes through and goes to the real boss, who turns out to be
Koschei, yeah.
Koschei. But before that, he has another encounter with Sarita, who is revealed to have been his shadow the whole time.
Yeah, and watching him, the shadow is basically a spy watching him.
Right.
But luckily, he turns out the lights before he beds any women, so he can't be. So she doesn't know that he actually fornicated with anybody.
Right. Yeah. Sarita's very moral and saying, so
if he. Yeah, and she's also the one who granted him youth, so yeah.
Right. So she was basically I've been watching you this whole time to see what you did with new youth, and you completely blew it. You've done nothing but be roguish and stuff, and as I say, we can't.
But at least you didn't fornicate.
We can't prove that you slept with anything, with anyone.
So yeah, he arrives at, he talks to Koschei, and Koschei offers him the various women that he's been with. And we sort of went over this section, but yeah, he rejects all of them. and ends up going with his wife, Dame Lisa.
Right.
We didn't mention he had possibly killed her at one point.
His wife?
Thinking that, he meets his wife in the Guinevere section because Guinevere's running from a shapeshifter.
Right.
And he thinks that Dame Lisa is the shapeshifter, and he ends up beheading her. But then he sort of starts thinking, maybe that was Dame Lisa.
Right, yes.
And
that's
so
right.
there's some ambiguity of whether he killed her. But anyway, so...
I mean, she comes back anyway.
Yeah. And so at the end, it turns out that Koschei sends him back a year and makes the whole year not have happened, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's significant that basically Koschei says, well, wouldn't you like this? And he calls up all the women he's met over the course of the story and says, and Jurgen basically turns them all down one by one. And so that sort of hits the point of the theme of this, which is it's essentially about how it's almost... I almost want to say it's almost a Scott Pilgrim thing where all your exes reveal who you were at a certain point in your life. And it's they do all represent the stages of your journey as reflected through your attitudes towards women through life, because Guinevere is reflecting the fact that you're, you have this romantic gallantry towards and this idealization of women, and Aedis is when you get horny. not that he wasn't horny before, but then it becomes, well, there are sexual because he's sort of given up on the romantic illusion, so it's just, well, I'll find it in Eros, as it were. Then he marries Chloris, and it's like, well, then it's being happily married, as it were. Florimel is actually, marriage when it's like she knows how awful you are and you know how awful she is, but you're kind of okay with that, basically. Yeah. That was almost the joke of that part.
Though she doesn't come back. Not all of them come back.
No, and instead of Chloris, it's Helen of Troy, actually, who's off, which does make sense because Koschei's trying to distract him with all the beautiful women he could have instead. Whereas Chloris is beautiful, but she's not. She's referred to recurrently as like homely and regular and more just comfy rather than sexy and beautiful.
There's a line throughout the book. My wife does not understand me. A lot of every character says it. And there's another part where he says she doesn't understand, or no women understand me, but that's probably good because if they did, they wouldn't end up with me.
And that's the end. That's the end all and be all of it. It's like, wait, I had someone who understood me, who we understood each other. And that's the true satisfaction. That's the true happiness. We know each other for real, and that's why he goes to get his wife back ultimately at the end of the day. So that's the conclusion. Basically, he decides, I'm gonna stick with my wife. He opens the stick with your wife barrel, as The Simpsons has it, and basically goes back to who he was.
So this book is filled with all sorts of allusions to various mythological and even contemporary fiction from the time.
Right.
And one of the imaginary places that he's when in Cocaine, when he's being told of the other places he could go to, one of them is Meropis.
Your beloved Meropis.
Yes, I've mentioned this on the podcast before. That's a ancient Greek parody of Atlantis. It's mostly been lost, but there's sort of fragments of the story. It's sort of Atlantis, but it was created by a guy named Theopompus of Chios, who was a historian. He was just making fun of how silly this is.
You talked all about that in the call episode.
Yeah, I'm just... and also a few others, probably. He also pretends to be a king at various points.
Right. Yes. He keeps accruing titles as he goes through. He calls himself the Duke of Logris, which I guess technically he is because he married Guinevere. Or does he marry? He doesn't.
No, he doesn't. No, he makes up that it's a made-up place.
Yeah.
He starts increasing. He becomes a king and then an emperor, and then
exactly. He keeps adding, the titles.
Oh, it mentions. Another thing it mentions Telem, which is from the Gargantuan Pantagruel stories.
Oh, there you go.
Which is an upcoming topic, possibly our next one.
Yeah. So that's kind of cool.
And this has a lot of this whole book has a lot of parallels with that, with the raunchiness and the weird timeline and the metaphor, the fable-like metaphors, and
right. Well, it's not as raunchy as Gargantua, though. It's
not nearly.
It's sort of it's more the sort of what's the word, double entendre.
Yeah, this is the PG-13 version of that,
rather than actual sex.
Rather than actual listing of things the character wipes his butt with.
Yeah.
I can see a lot of connections with that, so that'll be an interesting thing to. I've almost finished the series, but not quite. So,
well, yeah, Cabell's clearly one of these guys who's like, look at all the literature I've read, and I mean, again, he clearly has a love of all the folkloric stuff, and the fantastical stuff.
But no, I love that it includes this stuff as like mixing fiction with mythology and real life places, and it's what I try to do in my work. Right. So,
and it's done in a way of kind of like he's almost deconstructing it and being. I don't know,
these are ideas.
Everything about this feels like it's being told to you by a guy who's smoking out of a long extended cigarette at a cocktail party in the 20s.
Yeah, you mentioned this
at Great Gatsby's, parties or something like that. He's that kind of guy.
Yeah, and what was it? F. Scott Fitzgerald. Sorry, I said his name wrong. Mm-hmm. There's a connection between him and the.
H.L. Mencken was a fan of Cabell's. He quite he apparently promoted his work a lot. Quite a few people
I think it was Fitzgerald's wife read it or something.
Was Zelda Fitzgerald?
Yeah, I think she was quoted as saying you must read this or something.
Oh, okay. I didn't know there was a Fitzgerald connection, but I mean, again, he would have he was writing at the same time, and he would have come out of the same literary movement, as it were, American highbrow stuff in the 20s. And I mean, and that's the thing. We talked about how he didn't sort of pursue fame, but people also said, basically once the 30s hit, that was probably not the kind of thing people were in the mood for, highbrow, but also very weirdly fluffy in a way, but also kind of, you only a highbrow person would read it. It wouldn't,
especially the Depression and then the war. And then,
exactly.
This is
very much like, he's almost the P.G. Wodehouse of it's the thing Bertie Wooster would read almost.
I can see that.
It's for the idle rich almost.
Yeah.
I mean, not entirely anyone, but just at the time, if it wouldn't have been for your average Joe, it would have been for the literary circles. Anyway. So it was probably inevitable that he didn't hang on. It is funny how thoroughly he's been forgotten, though.
It's unfortunate, and I wish I had read it earlier because I had heard of it, but it just I was at one point going to try to read all the precursors to Tolkien and fantasy, and I just didn't get to that. I think I hung up on the Fairy Queen, which I still haven't finished.
Right. And almost, Oscar Wilde, except Oscar Wilde tended to write very well. He wrote very moralistically, but it was to cover up the fact that he was always under suspicion of being immoral. So he had to stay on the straight and narrow. But it's in the same kind of ballpark. Mm-hmm. Anyway, anything else you want to say?
No, I highly recommend this one. I know we've talked about the plot, but it's like the language is very fun. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of repetition of certain phrases, and it's not a short book. It's not a long one either, but it's a quick read because it's very entertaining.
It's breezy.
Yeah.
And I would recommend, if you want to read some more of the Figures of Earth, and I kind of want to read the Silver Stallions, which
I'm thinking of trying to go through all of his work. So
so he did all these stories, and there's one that's apparently riffing on fairy tales that again is part of the Poitem cycle. The Silver Stallions is about Dom Manuel's knights following Figures of Earth, and they're all telling stories about, he's remembered as this great legend, and we already saw the story about how he's a slime bag. He actually, his motto, which I think comes up in Jurgen at one point, is his motto is Mundi Vulut Descapi, which is the world wishes to be deceived.
Okay.
And that's his guiding principle in life, is to, people want to be taken advantage of, so I'll take advantage of them, basically. So he's a rogue, and he rises to become the king. Anyway. So
seems to be a recurring thing.
Yeah, well, Figures of Earth definitely seems like, as somebody said, a mirror of Jurgen in some ways. It's almost him reiterating it in different ways. So anyway. But it's definitely worth looking up. Let's get a Cabell resurgence going in our society, and remember that there is just lots of fantasy out there that isn't J.R.R. Tolkien.
Not that Tolkien's bad, but just
No.
like there's other things.
He doesn't have to define it
Yeah.
as thoroughly. Well, it seems like our endless Wednesday may be coming to a close. We are Adam Prosser, the poet and pawnbroker, and Philip Rice, the master philologist. The show is produced and engineered by Alex Ross, who makes podcasts as they are. And the theme song is by Jack Feerick, whose music we assume is pleasing to Sarita. Just want to remind everyone that we both have Patreons, and subscribers can listen to the show a week early. Just look under Philip Rice or Adam Prosser at patreon.com, or go to neversleepsnetwork/series/what-mad-universe for the links. If you sign up, you also get comics, illustrations, and other stuff, and you'll help us afford the hosting and recording costs. You can also get this podcast via iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or your podcaster of choice. And if you enjoy it, please leave a review. It would also help us if you'd spread the word about What Mad Universe, or tell your friends, or link to us on social media. So farewell again until 2 weeks' time, Acolytes of Adventure, and we'll see you in the garden between dawn and sunrise.